Nobody in the committee room expected what was about to unfold. It was supposed to be just another routine Tuesday morning. Senators reviewing budget proposals, staffers scrolling through their phones, the usual choreography of congressional business playing out under fluorescent lights. The kind of hearing that C-SPAN viewers might use as background noise while doing household chores. But illusions have a way of shattering when Senator John Kennedy has something on his mind. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe and that like button. It really helps us bring you more stories like this. Professor Nathaniel Keys had arrived that morning carrying himself with the practiced confidence of a man who had testified before Congress twice before. At 62, he possessed the kind of academic gravitas that came from 4 decades in political science, first as a hungry graduate student, then as a tenured professor at one of the East Coast's most prestigious universities. His navy suit was pressed to perfection, his wire-rimmed glasses caught the overhead lights just so, and his leather briefcase contained 23 pages of carefully crafted arguments about federal funding for diversity programs. What his briefcase didn't contain, what no amount of preparation could have equipped him for, was a defense against his own words. Keys settled into the witness chair with familiar ease, the same chair where he had delivered confident testimony about educational policy reform 2 years earlier. That day had gone smoothly, earning him respectful questions and a few appreciative nods from committee members. Today, he expected more of the same. The committee room filled gradually, senators and staff filtering in with their usual unhurried pace. The mahogany-paneled walls, adorned with portraits of former senators who gazed down with stoic authority, had witnessed thousands of such hearings. Morning light streamed through tall windows, casting geometric shadows across the polished floor where camera crews made their final adjustments. But when Senator Kennedy entered, something shifted. Gone was Kennedy's typical ambling gait, replaced by something more deliberate, more focused. His usual easy smile was nowhere to be seen. Other senators noticed it immediately, the way his aide handed him not the standard thin briefing sheet, but a thick manila folder that Kennedy placed directly in front of him with unusual ceremony. Keys observed this exchange but dismissed it. Senators often brought extensive materials to hearings. He was here to discuss his specialty, how federal investment in diversity initiatives could transform higher education. He had the statistics memorized, the case studies ready, the success stories that painted compelling pictures of progress and possibility. The committee chairman called the hearing to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. "We're here today to discuss federal funding allocations for higher education diversity programs," he announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of decades in office. "Our first witness is Professor Nathaniel Keys from the university, an expert in educational policy and democratic discourse." Keys straightened in his chair, ready to deliver his opening remarks about the transformative power of inclusive education. He cleared his throat, adjusted his microphone, and looked up to find Senator Kennedy's eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made the spacious room suddenly feel claustrophobic. "Professor Keys," Kennedy began, his Louisiana drawl carrying an edge that hadn't been there in previous hearings Keys had watched on C-SPAN. "Before we dive into your recommendations for how taxpayers should fund your programs, I'd like to clear up something that's been weighing heavily on my mind." Keys smiled politely, his academic training automatically engaging. Years of faculty meetings, contentious student conferences, and live television interviews had taught him to project calm confidence even when sensing danger. "Of course, Senator Kennedy. I'm here to answer whatever questions might help the committee understand the vital importance of these educational initiatives." Around the room, the atmosphere began to change. Senator Patricia Williams from California looked up from her notes with sudden attention. Senator Robert Chen from Virginia set down his coffee cup and leaned forward slightly. Even the staffers, usually absorbed in their tablets and smartphones, began to sense that something significant was developing. Kennedy opened the manila folder with deliberate precision, his movements slow and ceremonial. Every eye in the room watched as he extracted a single sheet of paper. Holding it at just the right angle, high enough for Keys to see, but not quite high enough for the cameras to capture its contents. The gesture created instant tension, a feeling that the morning's predictable routine was about to be shattered. "Professor," Kennedy said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying more weight than shouting would have. "I want to read you something, and I want you to tell me if these words sound familiar to you." Keys felt his stomach drop, though he couldn't yet explain why. The confidence that came from thorough preparation began to crack at the edges like ice under pressure. Something in Kennedy's tone suggested this wasn't going to be a discussion about budget allocations. I'm listening, Senator." Kennedy held the paper steady and began reading with the measured pace of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Every time a Republican speaks, a fact dies a slow death." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, each syllable landing with deliberate impact. Kennedy paused, allowing the statement to settle over the room before asking, "Does that particular turn of phrase ring any bells for you, Professor?" The question hit Keys like ice water. His mind raced through possibilities. Where had Kennedy obtained that? How did he know? When exactly had those words been written? His carefully constructed academic composure, built over decades of public speaking and classroom management, began to fracture, like glass under sudden pressure. Around the room, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Senator Williams' eyebrows shot up slightly. Senator Chen leaned forward in his chair, no longer pretending to review his notes. Behind the witness table, a young aide stopped typing mid-sentence, her fingers frozen over her tablet screen. The usual background symphony of a congressional hearing, shuffling papers, whispered conversations, the soft electronic hum of recording equipment, faded into absolute silence. Keys blinked rapidly, his confidence wavering for the first time since entering the room. "Senator, that sounds like something that might have been posted on social media." During a particularly heated political moment, he stammered, his carefully modulated academic voice beginning to crack. "I can't say I recall the exact context of every social media interaction from recent years." Kennedy didn't allow him to finish the thought. With the same theatrical precision he had used to open the folder, he reached back and extracted another sheet of paper. The rustling sound seemed amplified in the sudden quiet of the chamber. "Let me refresh your memory with another gem from your digital portfolio," Kennedy said, his voice gaining momentum like a skilled prosecutor, building toward a devastating revelation. Keys watched in growing horror as Kennedy lifted the second sheet. His mouth went dry. His palms, usually steady during even the most challenging academic debates, began to perspire despite the air conditioning that maintained the room at a perfectly comfortable 68 degrees. "Republicans are a virus in need of a vaccine," Kennedy read, his voice clear and unwavering, each word precisely enunciated. "Anti-science, anti-fact, anti-reality." He paused again, allowing each syllable to sink into the consciousness of everyone present. "Now, does this one ring any bells, Professor?" This time, Keys felt the color drain completely from his face. He looked around the committee room and noticed that every ambient sound had ceased entirely. Every aide, every journalist, every committee member was laser-focused on this exchange. The weight of their collective attention felt like a physical force pressing down on his shoulders. In the gallery behind him, he could sense the presence of major news outlets. Sarah Chen from CNN had her laptop open, fingers poised over the keyboard like a pianist waiting for the conductor's signal. Michael Rodriguez from Fox News was already taking notes, his pen moving rapidly across a yellow legal pad. The C-SPAN cameras, normally positioned to capture routine procedural moments, had zoomed in to focus exclusively on the witness table. "Senator Kennedy," Keys said, attempting to regain some semblance of control over the rapidly deteriorating situation. "If those are indeed quotes from my social media accounts, I would need to review the full context and timing to provide an accurate and responsible response. Social media discourse, particularly during periods of intense political polarization, often—" "The full context?" Kennedy interrupted, his eyebrows raising in an expression that managed to convey both surprise and profound disappointment. Professor, allow me to provide you with the full context. Kennedy lifted both sheets of paper, holding them side by side, like pieces of evidence in a criminal trial. These tweets, and yes, they are absolutely, definitively, from your verified Twitter account, Professor Nathaniel Keys, Distinguished Chair of Political Science, publicly funded state university, were posted while you were simultaneously teaching courses with titles like Civil Discourse in Democratic Society and Media Literacy and Political Communication. The irony hit the room like a thunderclap. Keys felt physically trapped, as if the usually spacious committee chamber had suddenly contracted to the dimensions of a confession booth. The mahogany walls seemed to close in around him. The fluorescent lights felt oppressively bright. Even his perfectly tailored suit began to feel constrictive and suffocating. "Senator," Keys began, his voice taking on the defensive tone he often criticized when he heard it from his own students. Social media platforms often become venues for expressing the intense emotions and frustrations that emerge during periods of heightened political discourse. Recent years have seen unprecedented polarization, and sometimes, even academic professionals, like all engaged citizens, find themselves expressing frustration with political developments that they perceive as harmful to. Sometimes what, Professor? Kennedy leaned forward, his voice sharpening like a blade being honed to a razor's edge. Sometimes we forget that we're supposed to be educating young minds about the fundamental principles of respectful disagreement. Sometimes we forget that taxpayers across this great nation fund your salary specifically to teach critical thinking and democratic discourse, not to spread partisan hatred disguised as intellectual commentary. The directness of the accusation hit Keys like a physical blow to the solar plexus. Behind him, he heard a soft gasp from someone in the gallery. To his left, he caught a glimpse of Senator Williams exchanging a meaningful look with Senator Chen, both clearly recognizing that this hearing had taken an unexpected and dramatic turn. The young aide who had stopped typing was now staring at him with unconcealed shock, her mouth slightly open. Keys opened his mouth to formulate a response, but Kennedy wasn't finished. The senator from Louisiana had found his rhythm, and like a skilled prosecutor who senses the moment when a case begins to break open, he pressed his advantage without mercy. "You see, Professor, what troubles me most profoundly isn't simply that you said these things. What troubles me is the staggering disconnect between your public persona and your professional mission." Kennedy's voice carried the weight of genuine moral disappointment. "Here you sit before this committee, requesting federal funding to teach America's students about civil debate and democratic discourse, while you're simultaneously using your platform to call half the country a disease that requires medical intervention to cure." Keys tried desperately to straighten in his chair, attempting to project confidence he no longer possessed. The leather seat that had felt comfortable 20 minutes ago now seemed to cling to his back with perspiration. "Senator, with all due respect to this committee and the important work we're here to discuss, my personal opinions expressed on social media platforms represent my individual First Amendment rights and are entirely separate from my professional responsibilities as an educator. I have never, not once, brought partisan political advocacy into my classroom environment." Kennedy tilted his head slightly, the way a deeply skeptical parent might look at a child attempting to explain why the cookie jar was found empty in their bedroom. The gesture was subtle, but devastating in its implication of disbelief. "Is that so, Professor? Because I happen to have something else here that might be of considerable interest to both you and this committee." Keys watched in growing horror as Kennedy reached into the manila folder for a third time. The senator's movements remained deliberately theatrical, almost ritualistic, as if he were conducting a carefully orchestrated ceremony of revelation. What else could he possibly have uncovered? Keys's mind raced frantically through years of tweets, Facebook posts, Instagram stories, LinkedIn updates. How deep had Kennedy's opposition research team dug into his digital footprint?
I have here
Kennedy said, extracting what appeared to be copies of email correspondence rather than social media posts. Documented communication from 3 separate students, currently enrolled at your university. Students who describe, in quite disturbing detail, a pattern of classroom behavior that directly contradicts your claim about maintaining separation between personal politics and professional duties. The accusation hung in the air like an unexploded bomb, its implications radiating outward through the silent chamber. Keys felt perspiration forming at his hairline. Despite the efficient air conditioning system that maintained the room at a constant, comfortable temperature, the fluorescent lights seemed to pulse with increasing intensity. Or perhaps that was simply his blood pressure spiking to dangerous levels. Senator, I cannot and will not respond to anonymous allegations without proper context, documentation, and the opportunity for due process through established university channels, Keys replied, his voice taking on the legalistic tone that academics often adopted when feeling cornered by uncomfortable questions. Those claims, whatever their specific nature, represent unsubstantiated accusations that would require thorough investigation before. Are what, Professor? Lies? Kennedy's interruption was swift and surgical in its precision. Are you suggesting to this committee that these students are fabricating their experiences? Are you claiming that 3 separate individuals who don't know each other and have no apparent coordination have independently decided to manufacture false allegations about their interactions in your classroom? I'm stating that they represent unsubstantiated claims that would require proper investigation through appropriate university channels before I could responsibly. Kennedy cut him off with a simple gesture, raising his hand slightly in the universal signal for silence. The gesture was gentle, but carried absolute authority, like a conductor calling for quiet from an orchestra. Professor, let me ask you something simple, direct, the kind of straightforward, unambiguous question you might pose to your students in one of those civil discourse classes you teach. Keys felt like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truck, blinded by the intensity of focus suddenly directed at him. The entire room waited in suspended animation for Kennedy's question. Cameras zoomed in for close-ups. Journalists paused their note-taking, pens hovering over notepads. Even the building's ventilation system seemed to quiet, as if the institution itself was holding its breath. Do you believe that Republicans are a virus? The question was so direct, so inescapable, so devoid of academic nuance or qualification. The Keys felt his carefully constructed intellectual defenses crumble like a sandcastle before an incoming tide. Years of training in sophisticated academic discourse, in qualifying statements and hedged positions, suddenly seemed not just inadequate, but actively harmful to his cause. The entire room waited for his answer, with the intensity of spectators at a gladiatorial combat. He could feel the weight of C-SPAN's cameras broadcasting this moment to millions of viewers across the nation. Behind him, he heard the rapid clicking of computer keyboards as reporters captured every word, every pause, every facial expression. Senator, that was clearly metaphorical language, expressing my deep frustration with certain policy positions and rhetorical strategies that I sincerely believe are harmful to informed, democratic deliberation and— That's not what I asked you, Professor, Kennedy said quietly, his voice carrying more authority in its restraint than it would have possessed at higher volume. I asked a simple, direct question that deserves a simple, direct answer. Do you believe that Republicans are a virus? Yes or no? Keys looked around the room desperately, as if someone might materialize to throw him a procedural lifeline. But every face was watching, waiting, demanding an answer. Senator Williams was leaning forward in her chair, completely absorbed. Senator Chen had abandoned any pretense of reviewing his prepared materials. The young aide behind the desk had her mouth slightly open in anticipation, like someone watching the climax of a suspenseful movie. The silence stretched uncomfortably long, becoming oppressive in its weight. In that extended pause, Keys could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning system, the distant rumble of traffic from the street below, the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears with increasing intensity. The pause became so protracted that it began to feel like its own form of answer, pregnant with implication and damaging in its very existence. "I believe," Keys said slowly, choosing each word as carefully as someone navigating through a minefield, "that certain political ideologies and rhetorical approaches can indeed be harmful to the health of democratic discourse and informed public decision-making processes." Kennedy nodded slowly, like an experienced teacher who had just heard a student confirm exactly what he had suspected all along. "So you do, in fact, believe that people who disagree with you politically represent a form of disease that requires intervention to cure. Is that an accurate characterization of your position, Professor? That represents a significant oversimplification of complex policy disagreements and philosophical differences about—" "Professor," Kennedy interrupted, his voice now carrying the weight of deep disappointment rather than aggressive anger. "You're demonstrating exactly the behavior you teach your students to recognize and reject. You're deflecting instead of answering directly. You're using sophisticated academic jargon and procedural language to avoid taking clear responsibility for your own explicit, unambiguous words." Keys felt something fundamental fracture inside him. The careful academic armor he'd constructed over years of committee hearings, faculty meetings, and television interviews suddenly felt as substantial as tissue paper in a hurricane. The confidence that came from advanced degrees, published papers, and professional recognition crumbled like a house of cards in a strong wind. Around the room, the atmosphere had undergone a complete transformation. What had begun as a routine budget hearing about educational funding had metamorphosed into something else entirely. A moment of moral reckoning that transcended traditional party politics or policy disagreements. This had become a question of character, of integrity, of the fundamental responsibility that comes with the power to influence young minds. "You want to know what truly bothers me about this entire exchange?" Kennedy continued, his voice softening but somehow becoming more powerful in its restraint. "It's not that you hold strong political opinions. Every American citizen has the constitutional right to their deeply held convictions. It's not even that you chose to express those opinions publicly. That's your First Amendment right, and I would defend it." Kennedy paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room like morning fog rolling across a landscape. "What bothers me, what truly troubles my conscience, is that you seem incapable of owning those opinions. You hide behind sophisticated phrases like metaphorical language and heated political moments and complex policy disagreements, instead of simply acknowledging what you meant and defending it with intellectual honesty. You've become exactly what you teach your students to recognize and reject. Someone who uses elaborate language to obscure rather than illuminate truth." The professor sat in stunned silence as Kennedy continued, each word landing with increasing emotional impact. "You teach students to think critically, to examine their own biases with unflinching honesty, to engage respectfully and substantively with opposing viewpoints. You assign papers demanding intellectual integrity and academic honesty. You grade students harshly when they fail to construct logical arguments or defend their positions with evidence and reason." Kennedy leaned forward slightly, his eyes never wavering from Keys' increasingly pale face. "But when your own biases are exposed to public scrutiny, when your own words are read back to you in their full context, You can't summon even a fraction of the intellectual honesty you demand from 18-year-old college freshmen. Keys finally found his voice, though it emerged smaller and far less confident than he intended.
Senator, I want to be clear that those isolated social media posts don't represent the totality of my views or my comprehensive approach to education. They were momentary expressions of frustration during an exceptionally polarized political environment that—
Kennedy leaned back in his chair, studying Keys with an expression that looked disturbingly like pity. The look was more devastating than anger would have been, more damaging than contempt. Professor, I'm going to give you an opportunity here. A chance to do something that might actually teach your students something more valuable than any lecture you've ever delivered in 4 decades of academic life. Keys looked up hopefully, desperately grasping for any opportunity to recover from this devastating public examination. I want you to tell this committee and the American people watching this hearing on C-SPAN whether you were right or wrong to characterize millions of Americans as a virus requiring medical intervention. Not whether your words were taken out of context. Not whether the political climate was particularly heated. Not whether you were expressing legitimate policy disagreements through metaphorical language. Just whether your characterization was right or wrong. The committee room fell into absolute, cathedral-like silence. Even the building's ventilation system seemed to pause in anticipation. Keys stared at the polished wooden table in front of him, his mind racing through decades of academic training, years of careful political positioning, months of meticulous preparation for this hearing. None of it had prepared him for this moment of absolute moral clarity. This demand for simple human accountability, stripped of all professional and intellectual pretense. Behind him, he could sense the presence of journalists from every major news organization, their fingers poised over keyboards, waiting to capture whatever emerged from this moment. To his right, the C-SPAN cameras continued their silent observation, broadcasting this confrontation to viewers across the nation who had tuned in expecting routine discussion of budget allocations. In the gallery, he caught a glimpse of university colleagues who had traveled to Washington to support his testimony, their faces now reflecting confusion, concern, and something that might have been disappointment. The silence stretched on, becoming its own form of communication. In those extended seconds, everyone present understood that this moment had transcended its original purpose. This was no longer about education funding or diversity programs or policy frameworks. This had become a test of whether a man entrusted with shaping young minds could summon the courage to model the intellectual honesty he claimed to value above all else. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 45 seconds, Keys looked up and met Kennedy's eyes directly, for the first time since the confrontation began. "I was wrong," he said quietly, his voice barely reaching the microphone, but somehow filling the entire chamber with its admission. Those tweets were wrong. They were beneath the standards I try to maintain as an educator. And they were beneath the standards of civil discourse I teach my students to uphold every single day. Kennedy nodded slowly, but the senator wasn't quite finished with his examination. "And why were they wrong, Professor? Help this committee understand what you've learned from this experience." Keys took a deep breath, feeling as if he were stepping off a cliff into completely unknown territory. Because they dehumanized people based solely on their political beliefs. Because they treated ideological disagreement as a personal character flaw rather than a legitimate difference of opinion in a pluralistic democracy. And because they modeled exactly the kind of thinking I spend my professional career trying to teach students to recognize, understand, and consciously reject. For the first time since this confrontation began, Kennedy smiled, not with triumph, or vindication, or political satisfaction, but with something that looked remarkably like genuine respect for moral courage under pressure. "Thank you, Professor. That demonstration of intellectual honesty took real courage. The tension that had gripped the room for the past 40 minutes suddenly began to dissipate like morning mist under warming sunlight. Keys felt like he could breathe properly again, though he also felt like he'd been put through an emotional blender set to maximum intensity. Around the room, people began to shift in their seats, the spell of absolute attention finally broken by this moment of human acknowledgement. Kennedy gathered his papers and placed them back in the manila folder with the same deliberate care he had used to remove them. "You know, Professor, I didn't bring these tweets to this committee to humiliate you or to score cheap political points for cable news highlight reels. I brought them because I genuinely believe you're capable of better than this, and because I believe your students, all students across this nation, deserve better from the people who shape their understanding of democratic citizenship and civic engagement." Keys nodded, feeling a strange and unexpected mixture of exhaustion, relief, and something that might actually have been gratitude. "You're absolutely right, Senator. They do deserve much better than I demonstrated in those moments. So what are you going to do about it when you return to your classroom?" Keys considered the question carefully, thinking not just about his response to this committee, but about his fundamental responsibility to the students who would be sitting in his classroom next week, next month, next semester. "I'm going to return to my university and tell my students exactly what happened here today. I'm going to tell them that I made a serious mistake, that I allowed my political emotions to override my professional judgment, and that I learned something crucially important about the difference between holding strong convictions and expressing them in ways that honor, rather than degrade, our democratic discourse." Kennedy stood up from his chair and extended his hand across the witness table. Keys stood and accepted the handshake, feeling the firmness of Kennedy's grip, and seeing something in the senator's eyes that looked like respect, rather than judgment or political calculation. "That," Kennedy said, "is exactly the kind of lesson that might actually change some minds and heal some of the damage we've done to civil discourse in this country." As the hearing officially moved on to other witnesses and other topics, nobody in the room could focus on budget allocations or funding formulas or policy frameworks. They had just witnessed something increasingly rare in modern American political discourse, a moment of genuine accountability followed by genuine grace. The usual partisan battle lines had been temporarily suspended in favor of something more fundamental. A shared recognition that intellectual honesty and human decency matter more than political convenience or ideological purity. The committee chairman announced a brief recess, and as members filed out for coffee and private conversations, something extraordinary happened. Instead of the usual post-confrontation victory lap or damage control, Kennedy and Keys found themselves walking side by side toward the exit. In the hallway outside the committee room, away from cameras and recording equipment, Keys cleared his throat nervously. "Senator Kennedy?" Kennedy stopped and turned, his expression curious rather than defensive. "I meant what I said in there," Keys continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent years studying political communication and democratic discourse, but today reminded me that sometimes the most powerful message is the one you don't dress up in academic language or theoretical frameworks." Kennedy gave a slow nod, his expression thoughtful. "Good. I hope you'll remember that feeling when you're standing in front of your next classroom." Keys paused, seeming to struggle with something. "And if I'm being completely honest, Senator, I didn't expect to walk out of here having learned something profound about myself. I came prepared to defend policies and programs. I wasn't prepared to examine my own character." Kennedy smiled faintly, and for a moment the Louisiana politician disappeared, replaced by something more fundamental, a man who understood the difficulty of admitting error in public. Life has a funny way of teaching us lessons when we least expect them, Professor. The real test isn't whether you stumble. We all do that. The test is whether you're willing to get back up and do better. They stood in silence for a moment, two men from different worlds who had found something approaching mutual respect in the most unlikely circumstances. Then, Kennedy extended his hand once more. Keys shook it firmly, looking directly into the senator's eyes. "Thank you," Keys said simply. It wasn't the kind of ending anyone would have predicted at the start of the day, but it was the conclusion that mattered most. By the next morning, the hearing had become the lead story on every major news network. Clips of Senator Kennedy confronting Professor Keys, and more importantly, the professor's eventual acknowledgement of error, had flooded social media platforms across the political spectrum. But the response was unlike anything typical of viral political moments. Instead of the usual partisan celebration and recrimination, something different emerged in the national conversation. A trending post on X read, "Kennedy didn't destroy him. He challenged him to be better." And for once, someone actually rose to meet that challenge. Another viral comment observed, "We need more moments like this. Real disagreement, real consequences, real accountability, real grace." The hashtag intellectual honesty began trending alongside more traditional political commentary. In coffee shops and office break rooms across the country, people found themselves discussing not who had won or lost the exchange, but what they had learned from watching it unfold. In classrooms, from elementary schools to graduate seminars, teachers played clips of the hearing as examples of how democratic discourse could function when people prioritized truth over convenience. High school debate coaches used the exchange to illustrate the difference between deflection and direct engagement with difficult questions. On university campuses where political tension had been running particularly high, something surprising happened. Students began organizing discussion groups focused not on attacking opposing viewpoints, but on understanding them. The conversation shifted from who was right or wrong about specific policies to how disagreements could be conducted with both passion and respect. Professor Keys returned to his university that week to find his office voicemail filled with messages, some angry, some supportive, but many simply curious. Students who had never taken his courses stopped by during office hours, not to confront him. When he entered his first classroom after the hearing, he found it packed beyond normal capacity. Students had heard about what happened and they came with expectations, some anticipating defensiveness, others expecting political rhetoric, many simply curious about how their professor would handle this very public moment of accountability. Instead, Keys walked to the front of the classroom and wrote 4 words on the whiteboard. "Character matters more than cleverness." Then he turned to face his students and did something he had never done in 4 decades of teaching. He told them the complete truth about his failure and what he had learned from it. "I want to tell you about the difference between being smart and being wise," he began. "For most of my career, I thought they were the same thing. This week, I learned they're not even close." He told them about the tweets, about the hearing, about the moment when all his sophisticated arguments crumbled in the face of a simple demand for honesty. He told them about Senator Kennedy's challenge and his own struggle to meet it. "The most important thing I can teach you," he concluded, "isn't how to win arguments or how to make other people look foolish. It's how to be wrong with grace, how to admit error without losing dignity, and how to disagree without demonizing people who see the world differently." For the first time in years, his classroom was completely silent, not with boredom or distraction, but with the kind of attention that comes when someone is sharing something genuinely important. A student in the back row raised her hand tentatively. "Professor, what's the difference between holding strong beliefs and holding them responsibly?" Keys smiled. The first genuine smile he had managed since the hearing began. "That," he said, "is exactly the right question. And I think I'm finally ready to help you find some answers." Meanwhile, Senator Kennedy never tweeted about the exchange, never appeared on cable news to celebrate his victory, never used the moment for fundraising appeals or political advertising. When cornered by reporters in a Capitol hallway and asked about the confrontation, he simply said, "I didn't destroy anyone. I gave a good man a choice between defending his mistakes and learning from them. He made the right choice. That's how this country moves forward, not by destroying people who stumble, but by challenging them to get back up and do better." The hearing continued to generate discussion for weeks, but unlike most viral political moments, the conversation didn't fade into partisan talking points or forgotten news cycles. Instead, it seemed to plant seeds of something different in the national discourse. 3 months later, Professor Keys received an unexpected invitation. Senator Kennedy was hosting a bipartisan symposium on civil discourse and democracy, and he wanted Keys to be one of the featured speakers. Not as someone who had been defeated, but as someone who had demonstrated the courage to grow. "I'd like you to share what you learned," Kennedy's invitation read. "Not about politics, but about character. Not about being right, but about being honest when you're wrong." Keys accepted immediately. The symposium drew senators from both parties, professors from universities across the ideological spectrum, and students who had watched the original hearing and wanted to understand how democratic discourse could function when people prioritized truth over tribal loyalty. When Keys took the podium that day, he began with the same 4 words he had written on his classroom whiteboard. Character matters more than cleverness. 6 months ago, he told the packed auditorium, I thought my job was to win arguments. I thought intelligence meant having all the answers. I thought strength meant never admitting error. He paused, looking out at an audience that included Senator Kennedy, sitting quietly in the front row. I was wrong about all of it. Real strength isn't refusing to bend. It's knowing when to bend, so you don't break. Real intelligence isn't having all the answers. It's asking better questions. And real character isn't about never making mistakes. It's about what you do after you make them. The applause that followed wasn't the polite, perfunctory clapping typical of academic conferences. It was sustained, genuine, and somehow hopeful. After the symposium, as people gathered for conversations that crossed party lines and institutional boundaries, Senator Kennedy approached Keys one final time. You know, Kennedy said, I've been in politics for a long time, and I've seen a lot of people get confronted with their mistakes. Most of them double down, dig in, or disappear. You did something different. Keys nodded thoughtfully. You gave me a choice I didn't know I had. What choice was that? The choice between protecting my ego and protecting my integrity. For most of my life, I thought they were the same thing. You showed me they're often opposites. Kennedy smiled, the same genuine expression he had shown in that committee room months earlier. That's a lesson worth sharing, Professor. Keep sharing it. And he did. In the years that followed, Professor Keys became known not as the academic who got destroyed by a senator, but as the educator who had shown an entire generation that intellectual honesty was more valuable than intellectual pride. His classes remained packed, but for different reasons than before. Students came, not to hear clever criticism of political opponents, but to learn. The video of that Senate hearing continued to circulate, but its message evolved. It stopped being shared as an example of political combat and started being used as a model of how public discourse could function when people valued growth over winning. In a time when political confrontations typically ended in destruction or silence, this one had ended with something rarer and more